been loving you too long to stop now.
This episode is dedicated to Grandma Rose.
Hands down production.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. This dedication is coming straight from the heart, from the top of the dome. I have recently lost a rider, a sweet queen mother, now a grandsister, Grandmama Rose, 1920 to 2024. She came from the get it out the mud generation. And I had the honor and a pleasure to sit at her feet, rest in power.
Too long to stop now.
You are now listening to
Economics,
P.A.R.
labor, law,
That's People Activity Radio.
religion, sex, and war.
If you do not
I'm your
understand
host,
racism, which
John,
is white supremacy,
G,
what it is and how it works,
horse.
everything else that you understand will go You do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works. Everything else that you understand will only confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
Threat inbound to immediate shelter. This is not a drill.
Esto es una emergencia.
Notification message. This station has interrupted its regular programming and requested during this emergency, most stations will remain on the air, providing news and information to the public in a time area.
Today it's time to stop singing and stop swinging.
All broadcasters cable system shall transmit its emergency action notification message.
We are coming to get our check.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio. And I'm your host, John G. Horse. Welcome. You have indeed found your family in a peaceful place. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Once again, I'd like to dedicate this episode to my sweet queen mother, now a grandsister, Grandmama Rose. Yes, indeed. And I'm quite sure those of you who are listeners to Old John G have heard a couple of weeks ago, one of the riders, the great Godfather of codification, now a grandsister, Neely Fuller Jr. has transitioned. And I'd like to take this time to repeat a quote that I think is extremely constructive, or I feel describes our grandsister, Neely Fuller Jr. When I heard of the news of his transition, it's just a habit of mine to get reputable confirmation from things that I see on the internet. First thing I did was go to his platform, which is producejustice.com, producejustice.com. And on the platform, his team, in the tradition of Neely Fuller Jr., yes indeed, had a couple of quotes. One of them said, farewell to Neely Fuller Jr., October 6 to 1929 to February 1st, 2025. And underneath that confirmation of his transition, there was a quote that I thought was extremely appropriate, that described my view of the now grandsister Neely Fuller Jr. And the quote read, no fanfare, no celebration, just do something constructive. Quote unquote, the late, great, the honorable, the rider from a get it out the mud generation, Neely Fuller Jr. And if you ain't know, those of you who listen to me probably figured I've never said this out loud. Running across some of the interviews of Neely Fuller Jr. and sweet queen mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, prompted old John G to do something constructive, to, at the time of my epiphany from hearing these individuals over and over in these interviews, I thought to myself, people in my generation don't know who the world these writers are. And I say, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, the late, great, the honorable, the sweet queen mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, also a grandsister. I say her name next to Neely Fuller's because without the sweet queen mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, there would have been no book for thought, speech, and action, the compensatory code concept, written by Neely Fuller Jr. His words, not mine. He disclosed that information on one of the many interviews he had on the Carl Nelson Show. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I think it's appropriate that I play a show that I did a number of years ago when I was attempting to highlight the powers and contributions of sweet queen mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, highlighting the actions of love and dedication that she displayed, trying to inform those of us who find ourselves subject to black classification, not only in the United States, globally. She spent her life energy informing us on the why of racism, white supremacy, which collaborates with what is racism, white supremacy, the compensatory code concept of Neely Fuller Jr. Her words, not mine. She was inspired to produce this work as an academic, as a PhD of the Y, off of her interaction with a non-PhD, with a non-academic, just a working class, blue-collar, law-abiding citizen by the name of Neely Fuller Jr. And I'm gonna proclaim a low-key genius, as he was not part of the academic community. Everybody wants to call Neely Fuller Jr. Dr. Neely Fuller Jr., Dr. Neely Fuller Jr. Well, as it pertains to certification, he didn't have those. But the compensatory code concept is nothing short of genius. If you're ready to consume his perspective, his hypothesis, his findings from life experience. Now, I'm gonna get long-winded, and I'm trying not to get long-winded. I'm just trying to show respect, and I'm trying to honor. No fanfare, no celebrating, just do something constructive. There would be no People Activity Radio without these two mighty giants. There would be no John G. Horse trying to do something constructive. You understand me? That being said, as I fumble over my memories and my thoughts, I'm not going to have a long-winded presentation on this in honor of the grand Sister Neely Fuller Jr., but I will say that if you look at the title of my podcast, People Activity Radio, we do understand that is because of the 9 areas of people activity that Neely Fuller Jr. says are dominated by those people who we suspect believe in racism, white supremacy, and classify themselves as white. That would be economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. Those are the 9 areas of people activity dominated by anti-black white terror dominators, as our elder Kamal Cambone professes. You understand me? People Activity Radio, P.A.R., would not exist. That constructive effort by old John G. was inspired by Neely Fuller Jr. It's either true or it's not true. In honor of Neely Fuller Jr. and sweet Queen Mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, I'm going to replay a clip of an episode that I produced back in July 23rd, 2020, titled Honoring Our Warriors, Episode 3, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Dr. Lisa D. Cook, The Administrative Duties of Producing Justice, is the title of that episode. And in that clip that I am going to play shortly, I do my best to describe the union, the relationship between Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Neely Fuller Jr. that produced both works titled The United Independent Compensatory Code Concept, written by Neely Fuller Jr., forwarded by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, and from Neely Fuller Jr.'s mouth, she pretty much helped him write the whole book. And Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's text titled The ISIS Paper, The Cress Theory of Color Confrontation. The Cress Theory of Color Confrontation, The ISIS Papers. Without further ado, cue the clip. In the same breath, John G. Horse. And I'm going to answer that. See, when you're talking about warriors, when you're talking about fighters, when you're talking about liberators, you understand you got to always involve all areas of people activity in the area of education. We have had many a warrior, and under that context, we talk about some warriors. Now, these two just so happen to be female, classified as black under the system of racism, white supremacy, so that would qualify them as victims of the global system of racism, white supremacy, be it that they are extremely gifted, extremely talented, extremely touched victims, nevertheless, still victims. Now, we all know here, if you are a frequent listener of People Activity Radio, that John G refers to codification, and John G gets those codification references from a brother by the name of, the elder, an elder by the name of Neely Fuller Jr., who wrote the independent compensatory code concept for victims of racism, white supremacy. Now, under that context, I'm just going to go out and try to give a little story the best I can. There's not a lot of information about this story, but from my research, this is the information I know. This all may not be true, and I'm quite sure there are more qualified individuals to give the correct information on this story, but I'm going to take a whack at it from what I could gather. And if I am in error, I apologize in advance. And I'm going to tell you a story about sweet Queen Mother, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, because in my opinion, there would be no independent compensatory code concept for victims of racism, white supremacy, written by Neely Fuller Jr. Had he not been coached, had he not been directed, had he not been inspired by a young woman named Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Yes, indeed. Yes, I said it. Now, as I understand it, victims of racism, white supremacy have been suffering mistreatment at the hands of the dominant society in the United States for as long as the United States has been in existence, and during the 60s was a hotbed of transition and refinement of the global system. This was the period where a lot of the individuals classified as black were not begging, were not asking. They were taken to the streets, tearing things up, turning up, having face-to-face, toe-to-toe, mano-a-mano clashes with local law enforcement. The government's resources, military resources, were being used and stretched thin, trying to put out fires. And in particular, the fires that I'm referring to, social unrest by way of counter-racist violence of people who were classified as black. And in particular in Washington, D.C., there were a meeting of the minds in a small underground pub. And the ancestors and the creator would have it that a young student at Howard, I mean, she may not have been a student, but I know she was young, and I'm saying she's young because she was younger than Dr. Neely Fuller Jr., who was a retired veteran. And Neely Fuller Jr. and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing were at a meeting where a lot of black people just went to a meeting. They saw a flyer, and it says, hey, we're going to try to solve the problem in Washington, D.C. of systematic anti-blackness, racism, white supremacy, white terror domination. So the who's who of the Washington, D.C. community all showed up. And my understanding, one of our infamous or famous politicians in Washington, D.C., Marion Barry, was actually at this gathering of motivated people classified as black in Washington, D.C., but there was a lot of talking, there was a lot of diatribes, there was a lot of preaching, there was a lot of prognosticating going on in this particular gathering of people classified as black in Washington, D.C., I believe in the 60s. And I apologize in advance one more again if I'm getting my times and dates wrong, but hey, this information needs to be consolidated and represented to people classified as black so that we know this history, because this history is extremely important to us as a group, because Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Neely Fuller Jr. have provided us with the code, racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works, and they've provided us with the why. Why do people who classify themselves as white seek to dominate non-white people, in particular people that they classify as black? Let's move on. So, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Neely Fuller Jr. are at the meeting, and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing has said in interviews that she overheard a man with a funny accent saying something about a system. At this time, nobody had ever presented the global system of anti-blackness, white terror domination, and or racism, white supremacy as a system that dominates all areas of people activity. And she overheard this man with a briefcase and a bunch of papers in his hand talking about a system, and she started listening, and she started inching closer and closer to this individual who she did not know, and she started asking questions. What do you mean a system of racism, white supremacy? What is the system of racism of white supremacy? How does it work? You understand me? And from those inquiries, from my understanding, they exchanged information. And we have to understand, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was a young woman, and Neely Fuller was probably in his prime. And they could have got into a whole bunch of tacky interaction. But all they talked about from Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's testimony on a couple of interviews that I overheard, well, I heard her on, I believe on the Carl Nelson show, and on the context of white supremacy hosted by Gus T. Renegade. She said all they talked about was this system, because she was extremely intrigued by this theory. This theory would later, as we understand it, motivate and inspire her to write her own paper, which placed her livelihood in jeopardy. The Cress theory on color confrontation. And this theory would state, it was an essay, the Cress theory of color confrontation, while assistant professor at Howard University. In the essay, she argued that the drive for white supremacy / superiority stems from a pervasive feeling of inadequacy and inferiority from people who classify themselves as white. Now, from that essay, the Cress theory of color confrontation, she then writes the book that, listen, it changed my life once I read it. She then wrote the book, The ISIS Paper, breaking down the keys to the colors. Now, I am speaking fast because this is a quick hitter episode, and I'm just giving a brief presentation on why I thought it was important to do this show on Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Dr. Lisa D. Cook. You understand me? So back to Neely Fuller Jr. Once Dr. Frances Cress Welsing developed this relationship, this constructive relationship with Neely Fuller Jr., she suggested to Neely Fuller, you might want to put this in book form. Neely Fuller, write no books. You know, he wasn't even thinking about putting it in book form, but she said this really needs to be put in a book form. Our people really need this information, and if you need assistance, because I am in the area of education, I will assist you in writing the book. So, from Neely Fuller's words, there would be no book. There would be no independent compensatory code had there not been Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She helped him write it. She wrote the foreword. And she assisted him in all of the other areas of developing or producing his book, his piece of literature, which is extremely valuable to those of us who seek less confusion as it pertains to the global system of racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works. And then once Neely Fuller finished the book, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing then produced her work called the ISIS Papers. So you have the What It Is, and Dr. Frances Neely Fuller produced What It Is, and Dr. Frances produced Why They Do What They Do. So we don't need to reinvent no doggone other wheels. And there you have it. That was a clip of a show that I recorded in July 23rd, 2020, titled Honoring Our Warriors, Episode 3, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and Dr. Lisa D. Cook, the administrative duties of producing justice. And there are many sayings that our beloved grand sister Neely Fuller would say. First time, last time. It's either true or it's not true. I mean, I can go on and on. One of my favorites, stand by your work, by your work, by your work. You understand me? And in honor of Neely Fuller, I just stood by my work and played an episode that has aged well. You understand me? You understand me? Farewell to Neely Fuller Jr. October 6, 1929 to February 1st, 2025. No longer a victim. No fanfare. No celebrate. Just do something constructive. Quote unquote. Neely Fuller Jr. And I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And always remember, keep learning and stay codified.
One of these
what it is and how it works. Everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.